Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending our webinar on which is part of a series of citizen engagement activities that we're conducting as part of the ADAPT Centre and EU project called PROTECT. So my name's David Lewis. I'm a Professor of Computer Science at Trinity College Dublin. And I'm Deputy Director of the ADAPT Centre. So the ADAPT Centre is one of the large research centres in Ireland that's funded by Science Foundation Ireland. And in ADAPT specifically, we research the range of technologies that you encounter day to day as you engage with companies and with each other on the web. So technologies such as recommender systems, search engines, voice recognition systems, voice synthesis systems, virtual reality, augmented reality, personalization. So we're actively working in improving those technologies as a ICT focused center, but we're very aware that these technologies have become very powerful over the last few years and are having major impacts on people's lives, on our politics, on our relationships with companies, and indeed the companies that advance this are some of the biggest and most powerful companies in the world. So we're very aware of the privacy and ethical issues that arise from these technologies. So since ADAPT started in 2015, we've been also developing a direction of research where we try and address some of these ethical and privacy issues, and that involves not just working with computer scientists. I have to say computer scientists are causing this problem, but we can't solve it by ourselves. So it involves what we call interdisciplinary research, where we engage with between computer scientists and people in other disciplines. In particular, here we'll be talking about sort of law and philosophy, and specifically ethics, as well as computer science. So another aspect of this as a problem is, we feel very strongly that the challenges around ethics and privacy and AI in the digital sphere can't be also solved by academics by themselves. We need to collaborate interdisciplinary, but we also need to engage with society more generally. So this webinar is the first of three sessions we're running over the coming weeks to address a specific question, and that question is, who do we trust, or who do we trust to help us understand what's happening with our data? Our data is being collected from us all the time as we browse the web and interact with our apps on our mobile phones, or even as you walk down the street and being viewed by closed circuit television, or talking to Alexa in our homes. So we strongly believe that we need to engage more with citizens, not only in Ireland but around the world, to try and get their views and to help us to shape our research based on those views. So this is part of one of our citizen engagement activities. This webinar is really to try and lay down some of the issues. We are then on the 20th of May, we're going to be running a co-creation workshop where we're going to sort of try and, building on what you'll hear in this webinar, try and bring out some questions that we could ask in our final event, which will be on the 9th of June, which will be a citizens thinking. So this will be a session where we invite as broad a range of the public along as possible. We'll have a brief introduction, and then we'll be splitting into discussion groups. So what we're going through here is to sort of try and refine the sort of questions that we'd like to ask people, and in particular around issues of how is our data collected, how can we, how can people perhaps exert a little bit more control around that, and to give people a little bit of a heads up of some of the areas as researchers we think might be able to help there, but really with the aim to try and get some feedback from as wide a range of the public as possible about, does that make sense? How would you react to that? And to give us a bit of a steer in the direction of that research. So to do this, another important part is, this isn't, like old researchers like me telling the public, what we think should happen. We actually bring in researchers who are very much at the early stages in their career, and that will be who you'll be hearing from today. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers. So we have Andres Chomczyk, who's from the Vrije Universiteit Brussel in Belgium, in one of Europe's top privacy research groups. So Andres is a legal scholar. We also have Beatriz Esteves from UPM in Madrid, in one of the computer science groups there, working on sort of knowledge engineering approaches to helping people manage their data. So Beatriz is a computer scientist. And then finally, we have Heleh Asgarinia from the University of Twente, and where she's working in the philosophy department, and with a group who are again some of Europe's leading researchers in technology ethics. So we're specifically trying to give you a multifaceted or a multidisciplinary look at the problem, trying to address the broad issue of who should we trust with our data, and refining that into questions about, who would we really trust to help us understand even what's happening with our data, and what are the various perhaps legal, technical, and ethical issues around improving that situation. And I'll mention that Andres, Beatriz, and Heleh are all early stage researchers from a European funded project called PROTECT, which has a wider network, which again is a three-way split between lawyers, ethicists, and computer scientists. So we have lots of interesting discussions, and certainly there's a joke about a lawyer, an ethicist, and a computer scientist going into a bar. We just haven't written that yet, but we're learning lots of interesting things about how different disciplines address the same problem. So I think we're going to kick off with the presentation. So Andres, Beatriz, and Heleh are each going to talk for about 10 minutes. You'll have seen as you sort of logged on, we're recording this session. We'll stop the recording once we finish the presentations. And we would ask you either during the presentations, and we'll have some time afterwards, to put any questions you have in the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of the screen. So you could just put in questions at any time, and then once Andres, Beatriz, and Heleh are finished, we'll give them the opportunity to try and answer some of the questions as we go along. So we'll hold off then, and we'll do that all via the Q&A session, just for efficiency. Also, there is a live transcript feature if you wish to use that. Again, at the bottom of the screen, you can just activate that. We have a closed captions going on there if you find that helpful. So I think that was everything that I wanted to cover just by way of introduction. So I'll perhaps hand over to Andres, perhaps to share his screen and start going through the presentations. I hope you find that interesting, gives you some food for thought. As I say, what we're doing this really to get your viewpoints and to get some, get your questions and ideas for how we can elaborate this research in a way that really takes a broader range of viewpoints into account. So Andres, do you want to start sharing?
Sure, Dave, thanks for the introduction. Just let me get this up and running. It should be right there on full screen. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, just checking. Okay. So thanks everybody for attending the seminar. Thanks, Deb, for the introduction. And as Deb was saying, if you want to call it, our main research question that we have right now is exactly who should we be trusting with our data? So this is obviously not it might seem like a simple question, but obviously it has a lot of components when it comes to it. And obviously we're trying to tackle it from 3 different angles, because obviously the question might be simple, but its answer clearly is not. So we're going to be tackling from a legal perspective, from a computer science perspective, and also from an ethical and philosophical perspective. So when it comes to trust, I think that we can all agree that as of now, there is clearly a real situation of general distrust towards online service providers. We can all usually refer to any news that has been published in the last couple of years dealing with Facebook's shady practices when it comes to data processing. They usually use the information for other, not disclosed to the individuals or to all of us, objectives or purposes. We can also always think about the situation or the revelations with Snowden about those data transferred to the intelligence agency in the US. We can think about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And it's something that is not just stacked when it comes to online services. It's something that in general, in the last couple of years, we have been experiencing a general distrust. We can also, for example, mention the financial crisis of 2008 and all the problems that it had caused. It's clear that there is in general a distrust towards centralization and towards these really big companies that are a bit, if you want to be gentle with it, a bit shady when it comes to the practices. So one of the questions that we immediately ask ourselves is if actually, for example, being more transparent about what is happening can help to foster that trust. Are we going to be trusting more with these companies if they actually disclose what is happening with our, in this case, our data, for example? And obviously, as researchers based in Europe, one of the main questions that we ask as a consequence of this is whether or not the GDPR actually can be this trust enabler that we were mentioning about. Because it's the perhaps most important piece of legislation that we currently have when it comes to regulating how our data is being processed. So transparency in GDPR can be tackled as or viewed from different perspectives. We can view transparency as a principle. It's stated in GDPR that any data processing activity needs to be carried out in a transparent manner. These companies that are called data controllers have to disclose and be transparent at every single stage with the individual that is on the other side, that is called a data subject, about what is exactly happening with that information. Obviously, then we can see transparency also as a safeguard and also as an obligation. When we think about transparency as a safeguard, it's a consequence of the adoption of a risk-based approach in the GDPR. The GDPR basically what tries to do is to either mitigate or prevent any potential harm that we might suffer as a consequence of any data processing activity that involves our information. So, for example, let's say, and a typical case that has appeared a lot and has been covered in the media is, for example, if you're running low on battery and you're trying to request an Uber, for example, the application might charge you even more, and you don't know exactly why that is happening, why that is happening. So, as a way to mitigate this and the potential negative effects that the algorithms that are running in these online services might have, transparency can actually be of help in this regard by opening the so-called black box. Obviously, other typical example is when we have a data breach. Suddenly, a company suffered a cyber attack, and your information was leaked or obtained by a hacker. And obviously, you want to know if that happened, and if that happened, what you can actually do to mitigate that from your own perspective, disregarding obviously what the company that suffered that data breach needs to do to mitigate or prevent that harm. However, on the other side, we can also think of transparency as an obligation. Obviously, this is how most companies view transparency. They see it as a compliance requirement. And obviously, when they see it as a compliance requirement, and in this point, as a lawyer and as a legal scholar, I have to excuse myself of contributing to this problem. Obviously, when we see transparency as this obligation, usually it's relegated to something that it has to be dealt with by lawyers or by legal practitioners in general. And what happens? The typical way of disclosing what is happening to our information has typically been reduced to a privacy notice or a privacy policy. And what happens when you sort of allow a lawyer to write freely about what is happening? You end up with this. This is a printout of several privacy policies of the of some of the main online service providers, like for example, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, etc. And as you can see in this art exhibition and this work by this designer called Dima Jarabonsky, is that actually these privacy policies are extremely long, complicated, unclear, usually written up in a very legal or technical language. So in that sense, even if we see transparency as this safeguard that can actually help individuals know what exactly is happening with their information, the data controllers, these companies, are actually not doing anything to help in that regard, because they still see transparency as that obligation they have to comply with. Like, for example, the privacy policy of Instagram, if you want to read it from start to end, it takes at least 86 minutes to read it. And obviously, you can all agree that a first reading of something, we usually just stay with a couple of ideas or some notions of it. So if you need to read it at least 2 or 3 times, just add up or multiply 86 by 2, 3, or whatever times you need to actually read it. And you can see that actually understanding what is happening with the data is something extremely complicated. So the question in this regard is how actually can we achieve trust in online services? So in this respect, one of the main questions that we are sort of trying to answer with this series of events, and obviously with the participation of the public, that is our ultimate goal, is actually if all these companies comply with all these obligations that they have, if we can still trust them, or if actually we need new data governance models to supersede this, or to actually achieve this objective. So in this respect, we can see that there are 2 very big and different models that are emerging. On one hand, we have the so-called personal data stores, which obviously Beatriz will be explaining in a little bit more. And on the other hand, we have the data cooperatives or the data trust that Haleh will be tackling after Beatriz. And basically, what we're seeing is that both of these models are just sort of starting to be recognized by different proposals or different new pieces of regulations that are being discussed right now. For example, the models of data cooperatives and data trust are actually being discussed by the European Commission in its recent proposal for the Data Governance Act. The question, however, is that even if we propose these all new data governance models, in most cases, the GDPR is still applicable. And all the logic of the GDPR of having a company that controls your information, and then you, the individual, all of us as users of these online services, as the data subject that is, as the word, as its term says, subject to the controller, it's still applicable. So it's still an unanswered question whether these new data governance models can actually solve any of the issues that we have right now, or if actually they're adding more problems into the equation. So in that respect, it's something that we are opening up the question. Obviously, in this respect, we don't have the answer to it, but it's actually worthwhile to discuss if in the end, and as we're trying to boil it down to this simple question of who should I trust with my data, if actually I can still trust these big online companies under the existing data governance models, or if these new data governance models can actually provide new ways to trust these different entities. Like, for example, can I trust this? Can I trust a software, for example, that will handle all my information and I'm going to be in control of it? Or on the other hand, if I can, for example, trust in a data cooperative or in data trust that will be much closer to myself to handle all my information on my behalf. And obviously, all this phenomena of these new data governance models is something that is not happening in a secluded or isolated area or of the reality. Actually, decentralization also comes into play with all of this, with technologies such as blockchain and distributed ledger technologies playing a role in actually trying to eliminate these intermediaries and trying to put the user on the center and in control of all his or her information, obviously. So with this brief introduction from the legal point of view, I'm going to be giving the floor to Beatriz, who will going to be tackling the issue of personal data stores and this new data governance model that we were discussing just now. So Beatriz, all yours.
Thank you, Andres. Yeah, so like Andres was telling you, I will be presenting a bit to you an overview over a system that can help users regain trust over these data handling practices. But first, I wanted to have a brief discussion about this distinction between centralized and decentralized systems. On one hand, as we all know, we have these big tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and so on. There are centralized services that amount huge amounts of our personal data, of our data. And what this means in practical terms is that they don't share, we really don't have access to the data that they are collecting on us, and they are closed systems that don't share data between them, and so the control over this data is far away from our control. And for instance, each time you want to experiment with a new service, even if you want to use the same data that you already have on Facebook, for instance, you don't have an easy, clear way to move the data from one application to another. And on the other hand, in the last few years, we have been assisting on the development of this new wave of technologies based on decentralization. One example is the blockchain technologies, for instance, which are decentralizing financial transactions. And we have the famous example of Bitcoin. And also the Semantic Web, which is actually decentralizing access to the data on the web. So what these decentralized systems do in practice is detach the data from the service itself, and with this, the control goes back to the user. So with this type of implementations, like a personal data store, for instance, users can actually regain control over what information is shared, and under which circumstances, under which purposes, and so on. Examples of these services are, for instance, Solid, which I will be talking about a bit in a bit. But there's also other initiatives like the Hub of All Things, Miko, and so on. So why am I talking about Solid? Solid is a project that's been led by the inventor of the web, Tim Berners-Lee. And what actually it is a specification for decentralized personal data stores based on the web standards and protocols. So actually with Solid, users can take back ownership of their data by storing it and managing it on their own, while Solid applications have access to this information through dynamic access control rules that the users itself choose. So for instance, if you use a Solid app, you can store your data in any pod. You can self-host your pod. You can use one of the pod providers, and you can always store your data there because both Solid apps and Solid pods are interoperable. And also another thing is that the data generated by one app can actually be reused by another because of this interoperability. And finally, one more characteristic of Solid is that users can rely on pod providers, or they can self-host their own server, which means they can store their own data locally on their PC. So how does Solid gives this trust back to the users? There are two protocols for authentication and authorization, and that's the ones that I want to talk with you about. So for authentication, Solid uses the Web ID specification, which basically allows for each agent to have a unique identifier. So an agent here can be anything. So can be an individual user, can be any groups of people, family, friends, or can be organizations, companies. So this web ID is the process which you use to log in into any Solid apps, to log in into your pod, and actually to manage the access control rules over the data stored in the pods. And one final thing about the storage in Solid is that pod providers have to be compliant with the law of the countries in which they are operating. This means that, for instance, if a user is using Solid in Europe, the GDPR applies regardless of where the pod is being stored. So how does an access rule look like in Solid? You can see an example here on the left. And basically what this means is that Beatriz, as she's identified by the web ID marked in the green box, has access to the file stored, to the file one stored on the docs folder in her pod, and can read, write, and control the access over this file. And one great thing about Solid is that lay users don't have to understand how to code these kinds of authorizations, because you have a drag and drop option, and you can define these authorizations without knowing what is happening behind the scenes with the code. So to conclude, a few advantages that a system like Solid can give the users is that by default, the access to the resources is not allowed unless the user gives active consent, which is actually aligned with the GDPR principle of privacy by default and by design. And another thing is that, as you saw in the example, you can give permissions to local files, to specific files, but you can also give more broad level permissions, for instance, over folders or even over the whole pod. And as you can see, it is much more easier to update and revoke access than on normal centralized applications. On the other hand, there's some disadvantages that still have to be worked on. For instance, there's no specific way to specify prohibitions, for instance, because you may want to state something like, I don't want my data to be shared with any third parties, and as of now you can't do that, but there's work on the way to be able to do it. And another thing that still needs to be developed to be more aligned with the GDPR is this idea of being able to write rules over specific types of data or over specific purposes. For instance, imagine that you only want to share your data for the purpose of scientific research. Right now you can't do that with Solid, but in the near future you will be able to do it. And that's it. Now Haleh will talk with you a bit about the ethical side of this problem. Thank you.
Haleh.
Sorry. Thanks, Beatriz. In this presentation, I have a philosophical perspective to the original question, and I want to discuss with you at the first stage why it's important to answer the question of who I should trust with my data. And in my view, power is a good answer to this question. We need someone to trust in order to regain our power in the digital age. And the power is derived from knowledge, and because of this, there is an asymmetry of power between data subjects and data subject, I mean individual who owns some data. And big companies, because these companies know a lot about us and we do nothing about them, about how they process our data, and also which kind of knowledge may be inferred from our data, and so on. So another question may arise, is that how to redress such an asymmetry? Data governance model, which have recently been developed, can answer this question. emerging data governance model aim to distribute power between different actors involving in a system. And since trust play a significant role in this kind of model, it's essential to answer who I should trust with my data. I start with make a distinction between two kinds of power in the digital age. First is a hard power. Hard power is defined as ability of powerful people and institutions to carry out their own will despite resistance. For example, in 2018, Associated Press found that Google was storing location data even when people had turned off location history. So while Google's support page stated you can turn off location history at any time, and with location history off, the places you go are no longer stored, but that wasn't true. For example, some searches were unrelated to where you are, such as searches for chocolate cookie, save your location to your Google account. And in order to turn off your location, you had to turn off a marker setting for the web and app activity, which was enabled by default, and store information from Google Apps and website to your Google account. So that's a kind of hard power because Google stored your data, although you turn off location history. But big tech doesn't only use hard power to influence us, they are also influencing us through soft power. So soft power is defined as a capacity of powerful institutions or companies to motivate us to think or do something that we would otherwise not have thought or done. And in the digital age, big tech and powerful institutions can exert their power through various means. For example, through different apps, different advertisement, fake news, fake group, and they can make us think and do things. So in other words, these powerful institutions not just towards acting the way they want us to act. And it seems the soft power is less forceful than hard power, but I think soft power can be just as effective as hard power in allowing the powerful to get what they want. And also soft power is often manipulative. For example, we are more likely to engage in behavior that undermine our best interests. For example, they can manipulate us to scroll down a newsfeed and making us lose our time and also giving us a headache. And what's worse with this kind of action done by powerful companies is that they do not respect our autonomy or right to self-govern. So in short, big tech make us act and think differently from the way we would in the absence of their influences. So to understand how big tech accumulates and exercise power in the digital age, I look at the relation between power and knowledge. And there is a tight connection between power and knowledge, as Foucault argued. Power produces knowledge as much as the reverse, and there is power in knowing and knowledge in power. And tech companies' power is constituted on the one hand by having exclusive control over our data, and on the other hand by the ability to anticipate our every move, which give them opportunity to influence our behavior. So there is an asymmetry of knowledge between data subject and big tech companies like Facebook. Facebook, for example, knows all there is know about us, and we know nothing about Facebook. And the power is derived from knowing personal details about someone is a very particular kind of power in the digital age. And big tech, through the power derived from knowledge, can influence us. And so there is a power asymmetry between different parties involved in the system, namely data subject and big companies. And the question may arise is that how to redress such asymmetries. Okay. Emerging data governance model can regulate power relation in the digital age. The power that stems from aggregated data should be returned to individual through the legal mechanism, and we need some bottom-up mechanism, and luckily emerging data governance model can provide such mechanism for us. And in these emerging models, a data subject choose to pull their right they have to over their personal data, and this model can help us to address power asymmetry, which I've already mentioned. Okay, different models are developed to help data subject to acquire their voice, and one of which is data cooperative model. In this model, data cooperatives play a role of trustees, and they can manage data on behalf of data subject. So a data subject retain and preserve democratic control over their data, and in this kind of data governance model, what matters is that a relationship of trust should be established between cooperatives who manage data and data subject on the other hand. And in some cases, trustees could consult the data subject. They provide agreements and contract for data subject to inform them. And data subject, on the other hand, can express their preferences and decide how to share their data with and with others and for which purposes. And now I want to compare the top-down approaches like GDPR with one of the bottom-up approaches like data governance model. For example, consider a clinical study in which a researcher needs sample to maintain the validity of study's conclusion. So they require to access consented data at least over a period of time. And okay, the GDPR allows researchers to process personal data for research purposes in spite of, for example, data subjects' request for erasure. So the researcher may override data subjects' rights simply by saying that the performance of a task is required, for example, for the reason of public interest. However, data cooperative or trustee can make a balance between societal benefits on the one hand and respecting data subject rights on the other hand. And they may achieve such balances, for example, by making sure that access to the data is restricted to health professionals and with particular safeguard, and also they can negotiate safeguard. So as a result, trustee or data cooperative play a significant role in balancing power between data subject and big companies who are processing data and who wants to gain value from that processing. An example of a data cooperative model operating with health and medical data is a Salus-Coop that lets citizens donate their personal health information for scientific research. So in the end, I want to say that data cooperative or other trustees enable data subject to retain control over their data, to regain power and regain their moral position in the digital age. And the precondition for achieving these benefits is that a relationship of trust should be established between data subject and data cooperative or other trustees. And since different kinds of data governance model are being developed, it's important to discuss who I should trust with my data. And that's a question that we want to answer in the following two meetings. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.
That's great. Thank our three researchers, Andres, Beatriz, and Haleh, for having a really excellent go at trying to summarize very complicated and interrelated issues between the legal and the technical and the ethical aspects of trying to understand who we can trust with our data, or how do we understand who we can trust with our data. So I'd encourage people now